Hi everyone and welcome back to Knit Kat Paddywhack. I'm Kat and I share easy knitting tutorials for if you're a new knitter or if you just want something fun and quick to knit. If this interests you, please consider subscribing to this channel. I hope you enjoyed my last video on my knit along baby blanket. So last time we did a bamboo stitch rectangle, which was our third square in the series, and we have also done a stocking stitch heart and a stocking stitch cat. And I'm making my blanket for this one in here. This is my second bub, but you can make your blanket for whoever you like. If you haven't seen my other videos in this series, I will link them below. I think that the first video, which is the heart video, is really important to watch before you watch any of the others, because I go over more detail about what kind of yarn and how to substitute that yarn if it's not available to you as well, and other things like tension and needles and all of that stuff too. So this week we're doing another different style of pattern. We're doing this two-tone textured stitch rectangle. So the stitch pattern that I based this square on, called the Stitch Diamond Tweed, which I think is a fine name for it, but I noticed that the little contrast colour pieces looked like little rabbits, so I have renamed this stitch the Little Rabbit Stitch. As you can see in the diagram of the finished blanket, the top row of rectangles features the darkest shade, which I've called colour 5, it's a dark brown colour. And the rectangle we're working on today is the rightmost rectangle of the top row. You'll be using colour 5 as your main colour, and you'll be using colour 3, which is a very light brown colour, as your contrast colour. If you'd like to find out how I made this square, please keep watching. It is a little bit more challenging if you are a brand new knitter, but I think that it's still something that a newer knitter can do. It just may take a little bit more concentration, so I hope you enjoy it. Alright, so let's knit this blanket square. So the yarn we're using is the same as what we've been using previously, which is the Valuable brand Gradients yarn in this kind of neutral browns palette. And the colours we're using are the darkest shade, which is this dark brown, which I've called colour 5, and the third shade, so the middle shade, which is this very light brown, which I've called colour 3. And so as you can see in the graphic, this is for the top row, so our kind of feature colour for the top row is this darkest colour, and this light brown will be kind of the contrast colour. And you'll be using your 4mm needles still, but your tension will be different to the other squares that we've done so far. So your tension for the Little Rabbit's stitch pattern is going to be 18 stitches by 40 rows, makes 10 centimeters squared using the Little Rabbit stitch pattern. So I would advise you to do a tension swatch, because even if your stocking stitch tension works out the same with a 4mm needle, doesn't mean that it will for the Little Rabbit stitch as well. So if you don't do a tension swatch, you are doing so at your own risk. And if you're really short on time, perhaps start knitting, and then when you've done about 5 centimeters or so, just check that your tension is about right, if you really can't do a tension swatch. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say tension swatch, check the description of this video down below, because I've got a list of just a whole lot of useful tutorials and blog posts that I found for some basic knitting things if you are new to knitting. I also think that a row counter is pretty helpful for this project. You could also just use a pen and paper, but it's good to keep track of what row you're on, because this is a little bit more complicated than the other blanket squares than we've done so far. So we're going to start with our dark brown colour 5, and we're going to cast on 31 stitches. So use the same cast on that you've been using for the other squares, just so that you're consistent. I like the long tail cast on. So there are my 31 stitches. I'll just take that needle out. And our first 5 rows are just going to be worked in stocking stitch. So like with the bamboo stitch square, that was the last square that I shared, we're doing a stocking stitch border. And that is just so that the edging is consistent for all of the squares. So when we seam up, hopefully it will look fairly seamless when you join it all together. So we're starting with a right side row. So stocking stitch means for all the right side rows, we are doing the knit stitch for every stitch. And for all of the wrong side rows, in this case the even numbered rows, we're doing the purl stitch for every stitch. So onto row 2 now, which is our first wrong side row, and we'll purl every stitch. So I finished my 5th row of the stocking stitch border at the bottom, and we're going to move on now to our first row of the little rabbit stitch. So I've just finished with a knit row, so we're on a wrong side row now, and this is going to be a little bit different, but because our tension is such that there are a lot more rows per 10 centimeters for the little rabbit stitch compared to the stocking stitch, what we're going to have to do is, when we do the 2 edge stitches on either side in stocking stitch, we're going to have to slip the first 2 stitches of every row. So I will explain what that means. So this is a good time to be using some stitch markers. You don't have to, but it might be helpful just to keep track of which bits are the border stitches and which bits are the pattern stitches. So I'm going to use them. So we're on to row 1 of the pattern. So I'll reset my counter back to number 1. And so what we have to do is, so our first 2 stitches and our last 2 stitches of every row are our border stitches. So they're in stocking stitch, but like I said, the first 2 stitches only of every row, we're going to have to slip them, just so that our tension with the stocking stitch and the little rabbit stitch is not too out of sync. So slipping means just simply transferring 1 stitch from the left hand needle to the right hand needle, or if you're left-handed, swap that. And usually when someone says in a pattern instruction to slip a stitch, usually that means to slip it purl-wise. So that means to slip it as if you're going to do a purl stitch like that, instead of to do a knit stitch like that. So if it says slip and it doesn't specify whether knit-wise or purl-wise, I would assume purl-wise. The reason for that is that if you slip a stitch purl-wise, it doesn't twist the stitch. So we're going to be slipping purl-wise throughout for this blanket square. Okay, so we're slipping the first 2 stitches. We'll add our little stitch marker. There we go. Now for the first row of the Little Rabbits pattern, we're using our dark brown, I should have mentioned that, and we're just going to knit every stitch until the last 2 stitches, because those are border stitches. So we've got to make sure that this working yarn isn't pulled too tight across the 2 slip stitches. You want to have it somewhat loose so that you don't have kind of bunching and curling round when you're finished. So make sure your working yarn is not too tight, and we're just going to knit every stitch until we have 2 stitches left. Okay, we've got 2 stitches left, so we're going to add our little stitch marker there, and because these are our border stitches, we're on a wrong side row and the border is going to be knit in stocking stitch. We're going to purl these last 2 stitches. So we've done row 1 of our Little Rabbits pattern, so we're on to row 2 now, which is a right side row. And we're going to change our yarn colour to colour 3. Now, as per before, the first 2 stitches of every row, we're going to slip them. We'll slip our marker. This marker, I'm not sure if you can see, but it says handmade with love on it. And I bought this back in 2012 when I went to England for the first time, and my aunt took me to a little town called Lavenham, which is famous for its little wonky houses, and my aunt is a knitter as well, and we found this little cafe called Cafe Knit there, which is a cafe and also a knitting shop, and I bought these stitch markers there so that I could remember the day. I have no idea if the cafe is still there, but I still think of it all the time because I use these stitch markers. So we're going to start the Little Rabbit stitch pattern with a knit one, and then we're going to slip one with yarn in back, which all that means is the yarn is behind your needles. And then we're just going to repeat that. So knit one, slip one, knit one, slip one, all the way until we have 1 stitch left before the marker. Okay, so I've worked that last slip one and we've got 1 stitch left, and we're just going to knit that one. And then we'll slip our marker, stitch marker. Now this stitch marker has less of a story behind it, but I made these simply by going to the craft shop, getting a bunch of these little rings, I think they call them split rings, and just a couple of little charms, and attaching them. I think they work fine, and they're quite big as well, so you can use them for quite thick needles. Okay, so on our 2 border stitches, because this is a right side row, and the last 2 stitches, we are going to knit them. Okay, now row 3 of this pattern is a wrong side row, and we're using our light brown again, a colour 3. So as always, we're going to slip our first 2 stitches and make sure that the working yarn is not pulled too tightly across them. And we're going to start with a knit one, then we're going to slip one with the yarn in front, knit one, slip with yarn in front, knit one, and carry on like that. And something that might be helpful just for keeping track of things is that the slip one for rows 2 and 3, they line up with each other. So you can see there's the little bar from row 2 and there's a little bar from row 3. So if you ever lose track of where you are, you can check whether the colours line up and whether the slip stitches line up. So I've worked my last knit one before I get to the stitch marker. Slip my stitch marker and purl these 2 stitches. Now I forgot to mention, but you may want to do these last border stitches, so the last 2 stitches of every row, a teeny tiny bit looser than the rest of your knitting. It's probably not a big deal, but it might help just to get the tension a little bit more even across. But slip stitches do have a way of kind of stretching themselves out, especially when they're on the edge of a row, so you probably don't need to worry about that. But if you're a bit concerned about the tension between the stocking stitch and the little rabbit stitch not lining up, then you can maybe consciously try to do the last 2 stitches a little bit more loosely. So onto row 4 now. We're going to switch back to our colour 5. Slip our first 2 stitches, and remembering to not pull the working yarn too tight across those 2 slip stitches. And for row 4, all we're doing is knitting until we get to the stitch marker. So we'll just do the knit stitch, now we've got to our stitch marker, so I'm just going to slip that marker and knit these 2. And onto row 5, which is the same except for the border. So as usual, we're going to slip our first 2 stitches and our marker, and then we're going to knit to the other marker, so the knit stitch, slip our marker, and then we're just going to purl these 2 stitches because we're on the wrong side. And that's row 5 done. So you can see we've got our first row of little rabbits done. You can see what I mean by them looking kind of like rabbits. That's why I wanted to rename this stitch. So row 6, switching back to our lighter colour, colour 3. Slipping our stitches for the border, and then for row 6 we're going to start with a knit 1, and then the bit that repeats itself is a knit 1, slip 1 with the yarn in back, and we'll repeat that. So knit 1, slip 1 with yarn in back, knit 1, slip 1, knit 1, slip 1, until we have 2 stitches left before the marker. So we're up to 2 stitches left before the marker, and these 2 stitches we're just going to knit them, and then we'll knit our border stitches as well. Row 7 now, still in the light brown, so we're if you haven't noticed yet, we're alternating 2 rows for each colour. So we'll slip our first 2 border stitches and our stitch marker, and for row 7 we're going to start with a knit 2, and then this is the bit that repeats, so slip 1 with yarn in front, knit 1, slip 1, yarn in front, knit 1, all the way to the end. And as you can see, for rows 6 and 7, the slip stitches line up with each other, and they don't line up with rows 2 and 3. See, they're staggered with each other, and when we finish this row, I'll show you on the right side what that looks like from the front. So we've got 1 stitch left before the stitch marker, and we're just going to knit that stitch, slip our marker, and then purl our border stitches. And now I can show you what we've got going on here. So we've got these little rabbits were made by rows 2 and 3, and we've got up here, which will become clearer once we've done row 8, but the other little rabbits are here made by rows 6 and 7, and they're staggered. So the first row is staggered with the second row of little rabbits. So we're going to do our last row of the pattern repeat now, which is row 8. As usual, slipping our 2 stitches. And we're just going to knit every stitch until we get to the marker. And you can see now our little rabbits have started to form. So we've got to our stitch marker, so we'll just slip that and then knit our 2 border stitches. And that is our first pattern repeat done. So the Little Rabbits pattern is an 8-row pattern, and we've just done our first pattern repeat. So what we're going to do now, until we get to the top border, is we're going to work 9 more repeats of the Little Rabbits pattern. So we've got 10 repeats total, or 80 rows total. So we're going to be knitting 72 more rows in the Little Rabbit stitch, following along, repeating rows 1 to 8 that I just showed you, remembering to slip the first 2 stitches of every row so that our tension can match between the stocking stitch and the Little Rabbit stitch patterns. So I will see you once we have done the 80 total rows of the Little Rabbits pattern, and I'll see you so that we can do the top border together. Okay, so I've finished working those 80 rows of the Little Rabbits stitch pattern, as you can see here, and all that's left to do now is the border. Now if you have a look at the little side border stitches, you can see that they kind of curl over themselves, and that's because we slipped them, and so the yarn wants to make the stitches even, so it kind of gathers in the working yarn that we carried behind. But that's fine, because we're going to be seaming up the blanket in mattress stitch, which means we'll be sewing from the front between the 2 border stitches. So it will just be this stitch here which is visible, so it doesn't really matter that this has curled over. So what's next to do is just to work 5 rows in stocking stitch, starting with a wrong side row, so that means starting with a purl row. So we'll be doing that in colour 5, which is the dark brown, so we don't need this colour 3 anymore, so we'll just cut a tail that's about 6-ish inches long so that we can weave it in at the end. And we won't be slipping any stitches anymore, we're just going to be working even in stocking stitch. So this is our first row, and we'll do 5 total, and we can take our row our stitch markers away as we get to them, because we don't need to keep track of where the border stitches are anymore. So once you've finished doing the 5 rows of stocking stitch, just to finish off, we will do our cast off. Again, use whatever cast off you've been using so far for these blanket blocks, and make sure you're not casting off too tightly. There we go. So that is all the knitting done for this Little Rabbits blanket rectangle. I'm just going to weave in my ends, and then I will steam block this piece to make sure the stitches are nice and even. And then that is our 4th square for the blanket finished. And there you go, our 4th rectangle for this knit along baby blanket. I hope you enjoyed following along. Remember that the written pattern is available for free on my blog, and I will link that in the description below. If you'd like to continue following along with this knit along series, please remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel and hit that bell icon so that you get notified every time I post a new video. And you can also sign up to be notified every time I post a new blog post if you go on over to knitcatpaddywhack.com. I'm really looking forward to working on this blanket with you together. Bye. Happy knitting.